What if the historical timeline we all know, the one etched into our textbooks and widely accepted, isn't quite what it seems? What if there's a different rhythm to history, maybe a secret beat spanning thousands of years, hidden right there in plain sight? Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to plunge into a truly thought-provoking source, Noel Joshua Hadley's The 7,000-Year Timeline Deception, Redeux. In this work, Noel presents a really radical reinterpretation of historical and biblical chronology.
Yeah, he argues that our understanding of his story, as he calls it, has been intentionally scrubbed or, rewritten. And he points fingers at various groups he called the controllers.
Right. And looking at the material Noel provided for this deep dive, he's quite specific about who he thinks these controllers are. He mentions groups like Benedictine monks, the Jesuits, Freemasons, even people connected to Bohemian Grove. He believes they fundamentally distorted the historical timeline.
Exactly. And our goal here, just to be clear, is to explore the details of Noel's arguments, the sources he uses, the conclusions he draws. We're aiming to convey the ideas in his original material impartially.
Absolutely. Think of it as a journey into a different perspective, not us endorsing it. So let's unpack this. Noel challenges some very fundamental assumptions about when key events, especially biblical ones, actually happened.
Indeed. And at the heart of Noel's whole reinterpretation is this core concept. Human history, from creation, literally unfolds in a 7,000-year segment. For him, this isn't just a metaphor. It's a precise framework.
Like the 7-day creation week.
Exactly like that. He sees history unfolding, like clockwork, he says, in calculations of 7.
And he builds this on a scriptural basis. He points to Bereshith, or Genesis 2.13. That's where Yahweh, or God, finishes work in 6 days and rests on the 7th.
And then he connects that directly to the Sabbath command in Shemith, or Exodus 20, verses 8-11, where the 7th day is hallowed, a day of rest for everyone's servants, animals, the whole household.
And Noah finds it ironic, doesn't he, that out of the 10 commandments, this is the only one God specifically says to remember.
Yeah, and he argues it's the one that's been most forgotten or, redefined by religious institutions.
Okay. And does this concept extend further?
It does. Noel also brings in the Shemitah, the Sabbath year for the land, and the Jubilee year. That's the 50th year after 7 Shemitah cycles, from Vayikra or Leviticus 25.
Right.
He really emphasizes the numbers here. 7 in Hebrew, Sheva, is the root for week. Shavua, it literally means 7. So for him, this cycle of 7 days or years points to a much larger historical rhythm.
Got it. And this leads to his main connection, the day is 1,000 years principle.
Precisely. He highlights Tehillim, Psalms 90, verse 4. 1,000 years in your sight are but a yesterday when it is past.
And as a watch in the night. Yeah, I know that one.
Noel argues that Moses, who he credits with Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, implicitly made this link, urging us to think in terms of 7 millennia for history.
And this is backed up elsewhere.
Strongly, by Kef Esheni, or Betty Peter 3.8. But, beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with Yahweh as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day.
Oh.
Noel sees that be not ignorant part as crucial, a direct instruction.
Okay.
He notes the context there is about past destruction by water and a future one by heat, suggesting a shift in judgment methods. So what's really fascinating is how he weaves these together, creation, Sabbath laws, prophetic writings, into this, cohesive 7,000-year timeline, where one day literally equals 1,000 years.
Okay, shifting gears a bit. What really jumps out in Noel's timeline is his claim about Yahushua HaMashiach, Jesus the Messiah. He says the Millennial Kingdom didn't start around 70 A.D., which is a common view.
Right, he puts it much later, the 6th century A.D. And he claims Messiah's actual arrival was around the year 5,500 from creation.
5,500. That's very specific.
It is. And Noel insists he's not just playing with numbers or calculators. He says he's drawing directly from ancient texts to show why.
So what are these texts that point to 5,500?
He cites several lesser-known ancient writings. For instance, the first book of Adam and Eve, chapter 38, says Adam and Hava and their righteous descendants would get fruit from the tree of life after 5,500 years. Noel connects that to resurrection.
Okay.
Then the second book of Adam and Eve, chapter 12, reaffirms this promise to Sheth, Adam's son. It mentions the end of the great 5 days and a half, which Noel interprets as 5,500 years, when the word of Yahweh would save him and his seed. He links that to the crucifixion and resurrection.
And there's more.
Yes. The book of Adam, chapter 13, apparently states Messiah would come at the 5,500th year to resurrect Adam's body, be baptized in the Jordan River, anoint descendants. Noel sees this as marking the start of Messiah's ministry. And finally, he uses the Gospel of Nicodemus, chapter 22. There are Sheth recounts a prophecy from the angel Michael, confirming Messiah's arrival in Sheol in the afterlife at year 5500 to raise the dead. Noel points out the text mentions souls waking from nearly 5 millennia of slumber, reinforcing that 5500 number.
Wow. Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. He's not just throwing out a date. He's using these texts, ones most people probably hasn't even heard of, to argue the timeline was, in his words, literally spelled out.
Exactly. And he suggests the commonly accepted canon, maybe influenced by Romans as he puts it, didn't preserve this specific timeline.
So after the 5500 mark, what's the next big milestone in Noel's timeline?
The 6,000-year mark. Noel argues this point is also prophesied specifically for the arrival of two figures, Chanok, or Enoch, and Eliyahu, Elijah.
Enoch and Elijah. How does he support that?
His main source here is the Gospel of Bartholomew. He cites both the Greek and Slavonic versions. In chapter 1, verses 16-17, there's this scene where Satan and the prince of Sheol are arguing about who Yahusha is, and Sheol apparently says, "Not yet are 6,000 years accomplished."
Implying
that it couldn't be Eliyahu or Chanok showing up because they weren't expected until that 6,000-year point.
Okay, that directly challenges the common idea about John the Baptist being Elijah, doesn't it?
It does. And Noel tackles that head-on with a three-part argument.
Which is?
First, John himself explicitly denied being Eliyahu. That's in the Gospel of John chapter 1.
Okay.
Second, the angel in Luke 1:17 said John would come in the spirit and power of Eliyahu, not actually as Eliyahu incarnate. A crucial distinction for Noel.
Right. Spirit and power, not the person himself.
Exactly. And third, Noel points to the transfiguration in Matthew 17. Eliyahu appears there with Moses. Noel finds it awkward, as he puts it, if Eliyahu had already come and gone as John the Baptist.
So what does Noel see as Elijah's actual mission then, if not John?
He looks at the Targums, the Aramaic paraphrases of Scripture. Exodus 6.18 in the Targum identifies Phinehas as Eliyahu and says he'll be sent to the captivity of Yeshurel at the end of the days.
The end of days, aligning with that 6,000-year mark.
That's Noel's connection. He also cites Deuteronomy 30 in the Targum, describing Eliyahu participating in the literal regathering of Israel and, implicitly, the resurrection. He argues John the Baptizer just doesn't fit that bigger prophetic picture.
And how does Noel connect this 6,000-year mark to actual historical periods?
This is key. He argues the 6,000-year point, remember that's 500 years after his date for Messiah's arrival at 5500, lines up with the beginning of the Middle Ages, or the Dark Ages, around 500 A.D.
Okay.
He even cites a kids' history website, History, Middle Ages for Kids, that places the start of the Dark Ages at 500 A.D., running for 1,000 years to 1,000 A.D.
So he's saying the Dark Ages weren't dark.
Exactly the opposite. He argues this period, usually seen as one of decline, was actually the start of Messiah's kingdom. The narrative got flipped, he says, to hide this.
Flipped by who?
By the controllers again. He connects the fall of Rome to this period too, citing Lamentations 4.22 from the Targum, which talks about the congregation of Zion being freed by King Mashiach and Eliyahu right when Rome is punished.
So he rejects the idea that Rome just sort of moved or morphed.
Yeah, he challenges that, suggesting that maybe official history just papered over the gap, turning what he calls the light age of Messiah into a dark one. So putting it all together, Noel's proposing that what we call the Dark Ages might actually be a mislabeled Golden Age prophecy fulfilled, but deliberately hidden by those he calls the satanic elite.
That's a pretty huge claim. And it hinges on this idea that the timeline itself was tampered with, right? Scrubbed, as he puts it.
Precisely. His main evidence for this scrubbing comes from comparing the Hebrew Masoretic text, the basis for most modern Old Testaments, with the much older Greek Septuagint, the LXX.
What kind of discrepancies does he find?
Significant ones, particularly in the genealogies, the lifespans, and begetting ages of the patriarchs in Genesis. He sees it as purposeful intent, like someone moving the goalie net.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Genesis 5.3. The Masoretic text says Adam was 130 when he fathered Sheath. The LXX says 230.
Wow, 100-year difference right there.
And it adds up. Noel calculates that from Adam to the flood, the Masoretic timeline is about 1,656 years. The LXX timeline, 2,242 years. That's nearly 600 years difference.
Okay.
And after the flood, from the flood to Abram, the gap gets even bigger. Masoretic is about 292 years. The LXX gives 168 years. That's almost a 1,000-year discrepancy.
A whole millennium difference.
Yeah. And he also points out specific omissions, like the Masoretic text skipping a generation, Queenan, between Arpachshad and Chanok, while the LXX includes him.
But Noel notes that some dates are consistent across both texts.
Right. Like Terach's birth year, Chanok's birth year, the year of Noah's flood, these match up. For Noel, this inconsistency, some dates matching others wildly different, proves it wasn't just accidental errors, it was deliberate manipulation.
Why keep some dates the same then?
He suggests those details were kept because so many other texts mention those exact same details, making them harder to fudge without causing obvious contradictions.
And the purpose of shortening the timeline, according to Noel?
He believes it was done to hide two main things. First, a recent catastrophic mud flood event. That's a whole other theory about a global cataclysm reshaping the earth relatively recently. And second, the true timing of Messiah's millennial kingdom.
Making it seem like we're much earlier in the overall timeline than we really are.
Exactly. Pushing the end times further off, perhaps.
What about that Gospel of Nicodemus again? Didn't it mention the LXX?
It did. Noel brings up chapter 22 again, where the Yahudim, the Jewish leaders, tell Pilate they found the 5,500-year prophecy in the first of the 70 books, which Noel identifies as the LXX.
But you said the calculation in Nicodemus didn't quite add up to 5,500.
Right. The sum mentioned there is 4,964 years. Noel acknowledges this discrepancy, but he still argues it shows the LXX tradition was aligned with a longer 5,500-year timeline framework, even if the specific numbers got garbled later by scribes or came from slightly different source texts. He suggests maybe the books removed from the standard canon escaped the fate of the scribe's pen.
Okay, this is a lot about texts and numbers. But Noel also talks about physical evidence, right? These melted cities.
Yes, this is maybe his most dramatic claim. He argues that the judgment by fervent heat, mentioned in 2 Peter chapter 3.
Where it says, the elements shall melt with fervent heat, the earth also, and the works that are therein shall be burned up.
That exact passage. Noel claims this has already happened.
Already happened. Wow. What's his evidence?
He points to photographs and descriptions of certain ancient sites, Hosep Castle in Turkey, for example. He describes parts of it looking like a glob of rock, very unpolished, almost alien, or melted looking in the foundation, contrasting with other, more finished parts. He suggests only a section survived this intense heat.
Okay. And Petra.
Petra in Jordan, too. He describes it as looking melted, with columns that aren't symmetrical and this weird residue, like a fresh coating of glop from extreme heat, even though it looks carved at first glance.
So he thinks these weren't carved, or not entirely, they were melted?
Or partially melted after being built or carved. His argument is that this melting occurred after the New Testament was written, showing Yahweh shifting judgment from water, like Noah's flood, to heat, as Peter prophesied.
So stepping back, Noel isn't just deciphering texts, he's looking at the physical world, at ruins.
In seeing evidence, literal evidence etched into stone, he believes, of a massive heat-based cataclysm that reshaped things.
And that this event, tied to his timeline, was basically covered up or written out of mainstream history.
That's the core of the deception he's describing. It challenges you to look at familiar landscapes maybe a little differently.
No, Noel also claims that this 5,500 or 6,000-year timeline wasn't just his idea or found only in obscure texts. He says early church fathers anticipated it.
Yes, he argues many prominent early figures held similar views. He's careful to say he doesn't claim, spiritual descendancy from them, but he acknowledges their historical role and says they collectively anticipated these timelines.
Okay, who does he mention?
He starts with Theophilus of Antioch, late 2nd century. In a work called Theophilus de Autolycus, he calculated the world's age up to his time as 5,698 years.
Which is very close to 6,000.
Exactly. Noel sees that as pointing towards 6,000 years being a significant culmination point, only about 200 years away from Theophilus' time. Then there's Julius Africanus, early 3rd century. He apparently stated directly that the Lord appeared in year 5,500, and that 6,000 years must needs be accomplished for the Sabbath rest to come.
Okay, so fairly explicit mentions.
Quite. And Cyprian of Carthage, mid-3rd century, noted that 6,000 years are now nearly completed, and talked about a 7,000 years divine arrangement. Noel interprets this as anticipating a 1,000-year reign of peace. Shalom.
And Victorinus.
Victorinus, late 3rd century, in a piece on the creation of the world was maybe the clearest. He wrote, "The true Sabbath will be in the 7th millenary of years, when Christ with his elect shall reign." Noel stresses how unambiguous that sounds, a physical reign in the 7th millennium.
Any others? This seems like a consistent theme.
It does. Lactantius, early 4th century, wrote in his Divine Institutes about the world lasting for 6 ages, that is 6,000 years, after which wickedness would end and righteousness would reign for 1,000 years. And Commodianus, mid-4th century, was very bold. We shall be immortal when 6,000 years are accomplished. He described the dead rising and the world burning at that time. Noel says Commodianus reached the same conclusions he did. Finally, Methodius, whose dates are a bit less certain, relayed that an age of 6,000 years extends from Adam to our time, and judgment would come in the 7,000 years. Noel notes Methodius uses the phrase, "they say," suggesting this was a common belief back then.
That's quite a list. It really does seem like this idea was circulating widely in the early centuries.
It raises that big question, doesn't it? If so many influential early figures believe this 5,500 or 6,000-year timeline for major events, why did that view fade away or get obscured?
And Noel has an answer for that.
He does. He points primarily to St. Augustine of Hippo.
Augustine. How does he fit in?
Noel paints Augustine, who lived around the turn of the 5th century, as an agent of Rome writing propaganda. He cites Augustine's Sermon 43, where Augustine basically dismisses all these calculations. Augustine said something like, "These calculations come and pass away, and still the coming of the bridegroom is delayed."
So Augustine was pushing back against this specific timeline expectation.
That's exactly how Noel interprets it. He sees Augustine's stance as a deliberate move by Rome's controllers to shut down anticipation of Yahushua's imminent return, because that return implied judgment on Rome and a challenge to his power.
He quotes Noel saying, "A true follower of Yahushua knew Hamashiach was coming to destroy Rome, and Rome's controllers couldn't have that."
Right. So for Noel, Augustine's influence was key in deflecting people away from these specific timelines, controlling the narrative, and neutralizing what was seen as a threat to the established powers. It's all part of the larger timeline deception, in Noel's view.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. We've taken a deep dive into Noel Joshua Hadley's The 7,000-Year Timeline Deception Redeux. We covered his core idea. History runs on a 7,000-year clock, like the creation week.
And his really striking claim that Messiah arrived around year 5,500 from creation, based on those lesser-known ancient texts. Plus the idea that the 6,000-year mark signaled the arrival of Eliyahu and Chanok, coinciding with the start of the so-called Middle Ages.
Which Noel argues wasn't dark at all, but was actually the dawn of Messiah's kingdom, later hidden by historical manipulation.
We also looked at his evidence for that manipulation, the scrubbed history, seen in the big differences between the Masoretic and Septuagint timelines. He sees that as purposeful distortion.
And then the really provocative physical evidence claims the melted cities like Petra and Hosep Castle, which he interprets as signs of a past judgment by fervent heat, just like Peter prophesied.
And finally, how he connects all this back to the early church fathers who seem to anticipate these very timelines, contrasting them with figures like Augustine who, in Noel's view, worked to suppress that expectation.
Noel really believes understanding these details is vital for figuring out our true place in history. He stresses that unlearning what we've learned is crucial for finding truth.
It certainly presents a radically different view of the past and potentially the future.
So the final thought to leave you with: if the timeline of his story has been intentionally distorted, as Noel argues, what other fundamental truths might be out there just waiting for their own deep dive? And how might exploring that change your understanding of the world around you?